Alright, in this video we'll begin our reptile unit, and we'll begin by just knocking out some general characteristics found in all reptiles. Obviously, there are exceptions to some of the things. We'll try to hit some of those exceptions, but for the most part, this is going to apply to all reptiles. All reptiles have scales. Scales are keratinized, epidermal, so they come from the epidermis, and which is the outer layer of skin, and they're keratinized, meaning the epidermis produces this protein called keratin, and it makes things really rigid. So that's why the scales have some uh, rigidity to them. Sometimes reptiles will have these bony plates on their outer exterior. This is like crocodiles and turtles and a few others. Their integument, or their skin, has very few glands. So this is different than the amphibians, which were full of glands. For reptiles, there are very few glands. Reptiles also have two paired limbs, and so they usually have 5 toes on each of those limbs. And as you can see, their toes are equipped with claws. And I said two paired limbs, two sets of paired limbs. And for reptiles, their limbs are going to be adapted for their lifestyle. So for some, it's climbing, for others, it's running or paddling, uh, in the water. Some reptiles have vestigial limbs, which vestigial means that there's a remnant. You can see that they were there at some point, maybe embryonic development. And some have just lost them altogether, like snakes, and some lizards even are legless. For the skeleton is well ossified, so you don't have a lot of cartilage present. They have ribs, and they have a sternum, and the sternum is the kind of, think of it as where the ribs connect underneath. You have a sternum too. It's right in the center of your chest, and so they have that. It gives the pectoral girdle in particular a lot more stability, and so they're able to walk with their legs underneath them, as you can see, kind of in a push-up position here. Their skull has a thing called an occipital condyle, and the occipital condyle it's a single occipital condyle, and this has to do with muscle attachments in the back of the skull. We have two occipital condyles in our own skulls, and it has to do with, again, muscle attachments and the way that heads typically sit on just how, a reptile is looking forward, whereas we are upright, and so it's a little bit different kind of anatomy in that regard. Occipital is just the back of the skull, and a condyle is just a thing that sticks off. All right, for their lungs, respiration is primarily by the lungs. Remember, amphibians had a lot of this breathing through the skin, but for reptiles, it's primarily through the lungs. A lot more surface area than the inside of an amphibian lung, which you can see. The amphibian lung is almost just like a sponge, whereas the reptile lung, lots of chambers, lots more surface area to volume ratio, which of course is important in most systems in the body. No gills are found in reptiles at all. And for some, they do use their skin to breathe, and a lot of them use their cloaca for respiration, which is a common opening for reproduction and excretion. For circulation, um, they have two circuits, so double loop circulation like we have with amphibians. They have the pulmonary and the systemic circuit, and the pulmonary just goes to the lungs, and the systemic goes to the rest of the body. You can see here in amphibians, it's called the pulmocutaneous circuit, pulmo lungs, cutaneous skin, and so it's kind of that combo, whereas in reptiles, not so much to the skin. And for reptiles, the heart is usually divided into 3 chambers, as well as a structure called a sinus venosus, which is like a collecting chamber. Some of them have this other sort of um, shunt here that allows them to be underwater or to hold their breath for longer periods of time as well. Reptiles are ectothermic, which means that they have to change their behavior in order to regulate their temperature. And so if a reptile is cold, it will set itself on a rock. If it's warm, it will find some shade. I think you understand this concept. All right, so they have a metanephric kidney. Not concerned that you understand the concept metanephric. It just has to do with the development of the kidney, and the last part to develop is the kidney, or is that metanephric zone. Not important. That you just need to know that reptiles do have paired kidneys, and when they excrete, when they get rid of nitrogenous waste, they do so by excreting uric acid, which is a solid kind of pasty thing as opposed to urine for amphibians and mammals. And this is to conserve water. For their brain and nervous system, uh, they have optic lobes on the dorsal side of the brain, which you can see there in that picture. They have 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and so this is a lot more intricate than anything that we've seen so far. A lot more thinking going on. Cerebrum's a little more developed. You can see, depending on the creature, they're going to have other, different senses that are going to be heightened. This is olfactory bulb. Olfactory is a sense of smell. So some reptiles have a very strong sense of smell. Some have very good sight as well. So a lot of reptiles are hunters. Almost all of them are predators, and so they have to have very heightened senses in order to capture prey. Separate sexes, and fertilization is internal for reptiles. And lastly is the amniotic egg. This is a big thing that separates them from amphibians. There's just an egg that is covered with like a leathery shell, or it could be a calcareous shell, like birds have that typically, and some reptiles. Um, Basically, this is a way for the egg to exist outside of the body or outside of water. It is a self-contained little system, and it allows that reptile then to lay that egg in the environment and not have to be tied directly to water, which is why reptiles did really well for a long, long time and still today are one of the most successful groups of animals on Earth.